Joining us this morning, Chief India Economist at JP Morgan. Sajjid, great to have you with us, and apologies for the delay. As you could probably morning. As you could probably hear, we got into a long conversation with Mr. Chaudhry. But Sajjid, let's address the major issues at hand. I've read some of your comments, and there's so many different aspects to this. First and foremost, the lowered forecast. How much worse do you feel it can get, given that we were already below the ideal? We weren't in a recessionary scenario, but we were definitely just about, sluggishly moving along.
I think to start with, we're in a period of kind of unquantifiable uncertainty at the moment, where it's very hard to figure out what the eventual impact on growth is going to be, because we don't know how long the shutdown will have to continue, both globally and in India. But here's the simple point, I think. One is that we've seen around the world that lockdowns have extracted in the near term very large economic costs. We estimate in the first quarter in China, for example, growth contracted sequentially on an annualized basis by 40%. We estimate in the second quarter, the US will contract 14%. The European area will contract 24%. So this is going to be, I think, brutal across the world. But the key is that countries don't have much of a choice at this point in time. There are two ways to go about this. One is to have a complete shutdown, enforce draconian social distancing measures. And we're finding around the world that those countries that have done that have basically gotten ahead of the curve. Those countries that have been behind the curve will ultimately pay a much larger cost economically, socially, with human lives. So I'm heartened by the fact that India has in the last 48 hours moved very quickly, and the country is now virtually shut down for the next 10 or 14 days. That's what will be required, I think, to beat the virus. What policy needs to do, economic policy cannot stop the proliferation. What it can do is minimize the amplification of the second round effects, both in terms of employment uninsurance and the second round impact on demand, as well as any worsening impact on the financial sector. So as long as we can dampen those second round effects, I think that's the best that fiscal and monetary policy can do around the world and here in India.
Right. Okay, so dampen the effects, clearly, Sajjid, that seems to be the call of order for the moment. What's the room you see for policy easing at the moment? Because we still haven't heard anything on that front from the Reserve Bank, despite the fact that we're seeing fairly aggressive measures around the world.
We do expect, I think, at the meeting next week that there will be a rate cut. I think what you'll need from the central bank is a package of measures like we're seeing around the world. We've seen the Fed, for example, both last night and over the last week, get very creative. So what are the kind of things one would need? Well, monetary conditions have tightened very sharply in the last week or so. And so I think a rate cut and with the promise of more should at least calm nerves on that front. Monetary conditions should ease. But I think we need to go beyond that if the situation gets worse. One is there's a sudden stop to demand. I think what's peculiar and unique about this situation around the world is there's a sudden stop that small, medium enterprises and indeed all industry will face. So faced with that, I think central banks around the world will need to ensure there's forbearance, and therefore there are no second round effects. And secondly, that credit and working capital are in fact flowing to the most vulnerable SMEs in the most vulnerable sectors. This could take various shapes and forms, some kind of credit guarantee or loan guarantees where the first loss is borne by the sovereign may be required at some point for banks to be incentivized to make sure working capital and credit is flowing. So I think from the RBI, not just a rate cut to ease in monetary conditions, we've seen a lot of liquidity being pumped in, 2 OMOs being announced, LTROs. So system liquidity isn't plentiful. I think what will be needed is sector-specific measures, both for forbearance and for working capital. I think one of the reasons the central bank has held off from easing, even though other emerging markets have moved, is the currency. Typically, when an emerging market currency is under pressure, central banks tend not to cut interest rates and further narrow the interest rate differential, which would precipitate more outflows. I think that's the reason the RBI is perhaps waiting for some sanity to return on that front before they ease rates at next week's policy.
Okay. Sajjid, there are two arguments right now. One, bring interest rates down and stimulate the economy. Second argument is there's liquidity in the system, low interest rates are not going to do anything because this is not about availability, this is about a breakdown of the system. What do you think will work in this environment?
I think as we're seeing from the Fed and other central banks, you need both. I think the first order, as I mentioned earlier, is really to ensure that there are no second-round effects. If in fact you find that SMEs are unable to honor their obligations, they don't have credit, working capital, don't have access to credit, then you're going to find that the risks and the pressures on an already fragile financial system will increase, such that you get more risk aversion, and even when the virus passes, banks may be disinclined to lend. So I think the first order of business is just to make sure there are no adverse credit events in the system, and that would mean some combination of forbearance and loan guarantees, as we're seeing around the world. India will be no exception. But I think you also need rate cuts just to ensure that monetary conditions don't continue tightening. And there the trade-off is, if you cut interest rates, you could put more pressure on your currency, which is what other emerging market central banks are finding out. They moved early, they moved aggressively, but their currency has come under much more pressure, and that creates its own financial stability concerns. So you're right. I think the first order of business is ensure there's financial stability, but simultaneously ensure monetary conditions ease so that you don't get this amplification that I spoke about earlier.
Okay. Sajjid, just as a financial market observer, what US government is doing is unprecedented. It's like saying that you are inviting, you put a billboard outside your restaurant which says it's for free and eat whatever you can. And yet financial markets, they remain nervous. The Dow yesterday was down 3%. The Nasdaq barely closed in the green. Why do you think financial markets in this case are just not responding to these big bazookas and missiles which US government and other governments are firing?
Because we're in a Minsky moment. We're in a moment where we've had 10 years of this economic expansion. We've had very easy, some would say too easy, financial conditions, where central banks have pumped in so much liquidity that a lot of leverage has built up outside the banking system. So Dodd-Frank did a very good job of clamping down on banks, but you had a lot of leverage built up outside the banking system. And now we've come to the situation where there's so much uncertainty, because the problem is not financial in nature. The difference in 2008 was we knew what the shock was, and therefore central banks knew how to respond to the shock. Here, a rate cut or monetary policy or financial policy will not stop the proliferation of the virus. So we're in this Minsky moment where there's so much fear around the world that people are selling every possible asset they can, not what they want to, but what they can, which leads to perverse outcomes. And everybody just in this moment of heightened uncertainty wants to hold cash or very short-term treasury instruments. So it's understandable that if the source of the uncertainty is a pandemic that some people, at least for a few weeks ago, believed is spiraling out of control, that economic policy will not be enough to calm the fears. But that doesn't mean economic policy doesn't have a role to play. Because even though markets may not respond to it right now, markets will realize a month or 2 or 3 months later, when the virus abates and things begin to normalize, that the policy was crucial in ensuring a 2-quarter recession does not become a 6-quarter or 8-quarter recession, because policy was successful in dampening the second-round effects, both on credit markets and labor markets. We haven't spoken about that. I think one of the things India will have to at least contemplate or consider in the coming weeks. By the way, I think the government needs full credit to ensuring a very sharp clampdown. That is the only way we'll beat this virus, if for the next 14 or 21 days there's a complete lockdown around the country. But that also means that there are informal workers in the urban economy who will need some support at the bottom of the pyramid, because only then will it be incentive compatible. Only then will these people be incentivized not to go out of their homes if there is some source of support. So the support here, as we are seeing around the world, has to be all-encompassing. It has to be credit markets, it has to be labor markets, it has to be easing financial conditions. Most of all, it has to be draconian social distancing to ensure that this exponential spread becomes a linear spread and finally dies down. We've seen China do that successfully. I think we'll be very surprised when the second quarter GDP number of China comes out, and you'll see a very sharp bounce back in activity, because unlike other episodes, there is no capital destruction here. So when the virus passes, you might see an equally sharp rebound to economic activity.
You think so, Sajjid? That's just what I wanted to ask you, actually. We might see that rebound, but look at the kind of forecast coming in globally. They're talking about 1%. They're talking about recession, front-loaded recession. Some people saying possibly some amount of recovery in the second half, but even that's looking uncertain right now. When you say that we could actually see a sharper recovery even on the economic front, just want to get your thoughts on the likelihood of that.
Yes.
because right now everything's up in the air, really.
No, absolutely. So we shouldn't get too ahead of ourselves. I think it's safe to say in the first half of 2020, we will see a global recession. I read out those numbers earlier. China's contracting 40% in the first quarter. In the second quarter, it's a bloodbath around the world in terms of growth contractions. The US, the Euro area, exchange is the lifeblood of all economies. When you shut the exchange down, it's understandable we're going to get a sharp contraction. But I think we should not focus so much on those quarterly numbers. I think the focus has to be, A, how do you contain the virus? How do you make sure that when the virus abates, the destruction to small, medium enterprises is very contained, so that there are no bankruptcies and no credit events later. I think if we can do that, then at least there is hope that 2 or 3 quarters down, we will see a semblance of an economic recovery. I think this is different, however, from previous crises, because the hysteresis here could be lower if countries can contain the virus in a matter of weeks and months and not quarters. And secondly, unlike an earthquake, for example, there is no large capital destruction here that will linger on for the subsequent quarters. So, there's a lot of dark clouds, but there are some silver linings here. I think at least in the last 72 hours, my sense is around the world, the lesson is very clear. You have to impose draconian social distancing. We're seeing that in the US, we're seeing that in Europe, we're seeing that in India. So hopefully, we've now at least figured out a global strategy to get around this. I'm surprised there hasn't been more global coordination. I would have thought that, this is the time where the G20 would come together. This is a global pandemic and we need a global response.
Sajjid, and I think we've been waiting to hear that, in fact, even since the G7 met, just a few weeks ago. What's your educated guess on why the numbers aren't higher in India? I know you're not a health expert, but just to get a sense from you.
Well, we're all epidemiologists now. No, I think India acted relatively quickly. I mean, if you look at, don't want to get too broad here, but if you look at what the top 10 destinations are for Chinese tourists around the world, you will begin to figure out why some countries have been impacted more than others. Because I think a lot of people did leave Wuhan before there was enough, understanding of how contagious this virus was. And, US is the top destination, Italy is the top destination, parts of Europe are a top destination. So in some sense, because Chinese tourists, constitute a smaller proportion, that was some safety valve for India. But I also think policymakers acted relatively early. We shut down some sorts of visas. We shut down flights internationally. But that doesn't mean the danger has passed. I think the key is to avoid community transmission. And we're seeing around the world that for a few weeks, numbers can remain very low. And the minute this spreads into the community, you get this rapid exponential spread, which is why I'm really heartened that over the weekend, the governments in India have moved so aggressively, and now 30 state governments have essentially ensured a lockdown.
So, Sajjid, what is the good news here? Let's keep the medical news aside for a minute. I mean, we get some magical discovery breakthrough. I mean, that is going to be the ultimate good news. But for somebody who's just looking at the market, feeling locked down, businesses are suffering, wealth destruction is happening. We always say that there is always, this is the darkest done before the dawn, and there is going to be light at the end of the tunnel. So as somebody I always admired for his intellect, tell me, what is the good news here, my friend?
Well, the good news is that there is no magic to fighting this virus. I think for me, that's the ultimate light at the end of the tunnel, that if all of us are self-disciplined, we know the incubation period is 14 days, and we know this proliferates when people get together. So, just think of this thought experiment. What if the entire world for 14 days did not leave their home? By definition, that would mean the virus would die down. Right? So the good news here is if we're disciplined, if we're coordinated, if information is shared, and we can buffer the bottom of the pyramid, whether it comes to SMEs, households, or unorganized workers, we can collectively beat this. This is not some external shock for which we don't have any idea of what the cure or response is going to be. Even before a medical cure comes, we can all stop the proliferation of this virus if for the next 2 or 3 weeks the world goes into a lockdown. We've seen how China has done this. China was racing behind the clock, and you saw that they essentially completely shut the economy down for 1 quarter, and now China is opening up rapidly. We expect second quarter of GDP growth is going to increase by 50% sequentially annualized. So I think the good news is there is a template of how to fight this, and I think we've just started going down that road.
Sajjid, just finally, I know we've talked a lot about what the government should do, but I'm curious, we're still seeing, excise duty hikes and yet and meetings with industrialists, but no concrete relief package, even though it's been said it's in the works. Are you hopeful?
I'm hopeful. I think the government has said that they're going to put together some things. I think they want to collect as much information as possible. I think we have to appreciate that, yes, this is a national emergency and the government should and will do whatever it takes. But I think we also have to be intelligent about our interventions. We entered this phase not with unlimited fiscal space. There are limits to, the US has the advantage of having this exorbitant privilege where it is the numeraire currency in the world. And so whatever its fiscal deficit, there'll always be unlimited demand for US treasuries. Emerging markets don't have that luxury. So we enter this period with not with unlimited fiscal space. So the government will have to be intelligent about how it uses its resources. I think what we need more than any big bang fiscal stimulus at a point where nobody can spend is to have targeted interventions. I know I'm going on like a broken record, to ensure that we provide insurance to those people that cannot work over the next 2-3 weeks in the unorganized sector. And the government takes a leaf out of what's happened in the US and perhaps takes the first loss on lending to certain sectors and SMEs so that credit, which is the lifeblood of an economy, doesn't choke. So I'm still hopeful that both on the fiscal and monetary side, announcements will be forthcoming. I think, however, in the meantime, we've done the most important thing. We've shut the country down for 14 days. If we had not done that, I think the efficacy of any fiscal and monetary response would have been much lower, and the ask would have been disproportionately higher.
Absolutely. Sajjid, good to hear from you, and important, of course, to reiterate some of those measures that we're clearly in need of. Thanks so much for joining us this morning, and do stay safe.
My pleasure. Stay safe.